Good afternoon from the Philippines. Good morning and good evening to friends and guests who are joining us from other parts of the globe. My name is Daniel Retilla, the Program Officer for Climate and Disaster Resilience at the Ateneo Institute of Sustainability, and I will be serving as your host for today's session. It is my honor to welcome you all to the third and penultimate session of our second webinar series, Climate Research as If People Mattered. The name draws inspiration from the article Small is Beautiful, Climate Change Science as If People Mattered, which was written by Dr. Regina Rodriguez and Dr. Theodore Shepard, co-chairs of the Science Plan Development Team of the My Climate Risk Lighthouse activity of the World Climate Research Program. It reflects on insights from E.F. Schumacher's celebrated book, Small is Beautiful, that may be applied in closing the gap between how climate information is being produced and used. Just a couple of weeks ago, we kickstarted this series with sessions with Dr. Vandana Singh and Mr. Raymond Rodolfo to discuss stories as pedagogy and stakeholder engagement and sustainable production. If you are a returning participant, it's great to have you with us again. But if this is your first time joining one of our webinars, we hope that you stick around for this session and our next session, which will be in a couple of weeks' time. Today's session is titled Conversations, Memories, and Dreams, Climate Communication that Goes Beyond Information Packaging. And if that sounds like a lot to unpack, then I'm sure you're just as excited and curious as we are to listen to our speaker later in the program. This webinar series is organized by the My Climate Risk Ateneo de Manila University Regional Hub, which is hosted by the Ateneo Institute of Sustainability. My Climate Risk, or MCR, is a lighthouse activity of the World Climate Research Program, which aims to develop and mainstream a bottom-up approach to regional climate risk. And in our previous series, we strove to have a better understanding of local contexts and experiences of climate change and the requirements of decision makers. In this webinar series, we will explore how the different contexts and experiences of climate change are considered and how we may apply these in research design and management plans. Today's session in particular will focus on climate communication, how we can shift our thinking around it, and how we can go beyond information packaging. Just some reminders before we start the program proper. Please note that the program is being recorded on Zoom. In Zoom, all participants are muted automatically as they enter the meeting room. Throughout the session, kindly type in any comments or questions in the chat box here on Zoom. Participants via Facebook Live may also type in their comments or questions in the comment section. We will collect these for the open forum later on. And finally, there will be an evaluation survey at the end of the session. Requests for e-certificates may be made through the same form. At this point, we would like to ask everyone to settle in for the prayer to be followed by the Philippine National Anthem. An interfaith prayer for our climate. May I be a protector to those without protection, a leader to those who journey, a boat, a bridge, a passage, to those desiring the shore of non-suffering. May the pain of every living creature be completely cleared away. May I be the doctor and the medicine, and may I be the nurse for all sick beings until everyone is healed. Just like space and the great elements such as Earth, may I always support the life of all the many creatures. And until they pass away from pain, may I also be the source of life for all the realms of varied beings that reach into the ends of space.
Magiliw, kailas ang sinanganan, alam ng puso. puso, sa dibdib mo'y buhay. Lupang hinirang, duyan ka ng magiting, sa manlulupit, di ka pasisiin. Sa dagat at bundok, sa simoy at sa langit mong bughaw, may nilagang tula at awit sa paglayang minamahal. Ang kislap ng watawat mo'y tagumpay na nagdiningning, ang bituin at araw niya kailan pa may magdidilim. Lupa ng araw ng walhati pagsinta, buhay langit sa piling mo. Ang hindi kaya na pag may mga api, ang mamatay ng dahil sa'yo.
And now, to formally welcome everyone to today's session, we would like to call on Dr. Nikki Carcy Cruz, Assistant Professor and the Chair of the Department of Interdisciplinary Studies at the Ateneo de Manila University, and a collaborator of the MCR Ateneo de Manila University Regional Hub, to deliver the opening remarks.
Good afternoon, everybody. To the organizers of this event from the Ateneo Institute of Sustainability, which hosts My Climate Risk, Ateneo de Manila University Regional Hub. To Dr. Theodore Shepard, Graham Professor of Climate Science, joining us from the University of Reading, who is co-chair of the Science Plan Development Team, My Climate Risk Lighthouse activity of the World Climate Research Program. To Dr. Kendra Gotanco Gonzalez, who is director of the Ateneo Institute of Sustainability and the focal point for My Climate Risk Ateneo de Manila Regional Hub. And to Dr. Prixie, or Dr. Priscilla Angela Cruz, Assistant Professor of the Department of English, Chair of the Department, and also collaborator of My Climate Risk in Ateneo, just like myself. And to our sign language interpreters, Edna, Comia, and Anadisa Regis Tolentino, and to all the guests who have joined us today. Good afternoon to all of you. I am greeting all of you from the campus, from my office here at Ateneo de Manila University. Yesterday, many of us faculty members and administrators in Ateneo were dressed in full academic regalia or attire as we attended a special event called the Traditional University Awards. It is an event that recognizes people who have been, or organizations that have been, transformative forces in society, ranging from public service awards, government awards, leadership, or in the fields of culture, philanthropy, or Christian formation. Most people honored at these awards are given these after many years of outstanding work in their fields. And the night or the evening is just full of acceptance speeches. I always cry at these events. I always bring tissue because in moments of great acclaim, speakers have to distill in 5 minutes decades worth of trials and triumphs. And they tend to zone in on the stories that most touch their hearts. A pattern I always see with these great acceptance speeches is that in this moment supposedly of great pride, they always turn to stories of the everyday, of the ordinary, and of the humble. Probably it's because they know that unlike in Hollywood films where heroism happens in that moment when a snap will save the world, the kind of work they do happens in everyday life. And they always recall the greatest wisdom came from a person who did this, a mother who said that, a man who asked for so little. The stories of the great are encoded in the many stories of the small. And it always touches our hearts because we see that the greatest work are works that register not just with the minds, but also with the hearts. And so when I was looking at this whole series that is inspired by small is beautiful, that paradigm, it feels to me like something that speaks to our hearts. The whole title of the series, Climate Research as If People Mattered, already signals that our hearts are in the right place. You know, in our department in interdisciplinary studies, I currently teach a research class that is a service learning class with the community. And some of my students feel they don't get a lot from conversations. But there are also people who find the beautiful in the very simple exchanges. There are two sets of students, those who hear and those who don't. And those who do and see the beauty and simplicity have done really inspiring things. One particular group that stands out to me is a group that was supposed to produce infographics about a livelihood project. They were clear about the practical output they wanted to produce. But when listening to the stories of the women that they were partnered with, they were so enamored with the stories. They changed their project midway and said, can we just make comics out of the stories? And using their talent in the arts, we found two kinds of storytelling taking place. It was the stories of the women and the storytelling of the students amplified in dialogue that brought about a new story, not just of relaying information, but of a transformative relationship where people became people to one another. Months after the semester had ended, the students contacted me crying because one of the nanays, one of the mothers they were talking to, had died. And the comic that they created for her became a snapshot of her life story. And it was profound for them to be part in that great way for something supposedly as simple as a class project. But what had become clear was that people mattered. When this group won an award, the women wrote in their Facebook page, malaking karangalan ito sa amin na nanalo ang aming mga istorya. And they said it was such a great, in English, it was such a great honor for them that their stories won an award. And there was a co-ownership and a coming together that their stories of triumphs and trials from disasters and from poverty became a story of triumph of the human spirit. So today's talk with Dr. Inez Ponce de Leon promises to speak of matters of the heart, because you see, conversations, memories, and dreams, they are not exact. They have their own flow. Memories have their own lives. Dreams take on different shapes. One may say they are unwieldy, but we can also say that in dialogue with one another, when human beings are in conversation, when our memories and what we remember and what we hope for are things we speak about, all these are drawn from somewhere within. And it's this place from within that will provide the fuel, the greatest source of inspiration for any action to solve the world's wicked problems. So I'm looking forward with all of you to listening to the speech or the presentation of Dr. Inez today, Conversations, Memories, and Dreams, Climate Communication that goes beyond information packaging. Welcome everybody to today's talk.
Thank you very much, Dr. Carcy Cruz, for those meaningful and very profound remarks. Truly, it is a gift to see the small amidst the great tapestry of our experiences and the humbling recognition of the power of stories. To speak more about those stories, it is, of course, now my pleasure to introduce the speaker for today's session who will shed light on the power of these human experiences. Inez Ponce de Leon is an associate professor at the Department of Communication, Ateneo de Manila University. She specializes in science and risk communication and teaches courses in qualitative communication research methods, undergraduate thesis, and science and risk communication. Her research centers around the public understanding of risk, community responses to natural hazards, climate change communication, and constructs of nationalism in online discourse. She received her undergraduate and master's degrees in molecular biology and biotechnology from the University of the Philippines, Diliman. Dr. Ponce de Leon is a consultant on agricultural biotechnology communication, a public speaker for topics such as science communication and research-based communication work, and a resource person for journalists working on science, agriculture, and natural hazard stories. She is also a weekly columnist for the Philippine Daily Inquirer, the Philippines' most widely circulated English language newspaper. She has also received the Distinguished Alumni Award from Purdue University's Department of Agricultural Sciences, Education, and Communication. It is truly an honor to welcome our very esteemed guest speaker, Dr. Ponce de Leon. Dr. Ponce de Leon, the floor is now yours.
Good afternoon, and thank you so much, Danielle. And thank you so much to everyone who is attending right now. Good afternoon from the Philippines. I am Dr. Inez Ponce de Leon from the Department of Communication, and I am honored to be your speaker today. Dr. Carcy Cruz could well have delivered my talk. That was a wonderful recounting of what happened yesterday at the university. And I think it fits our sentiments as a people. We love stories. Our hearts long for stories. Our lives long for stories. We like the facts. We like the numbers that accompany these facts that allow us to say that something is backed by evidence. But it's the stories that carry us through. Now, my talk begins with this. And I believe that this is a photo or a wood cutting that everyone knows about if you've ever been to Japan or know something about Japan. And I want to start with this photograph, this figure. When I was in Japan a few years ago, our tour guide showed this and asked us, what do you recognize in this photo? What do you remember about this photo? And most people would say the giant wave, which is true. It's dramatic. It's frightening. It's a wave that's coming in that is going to swallow people who are helpless against the forces of nature. All right, our guide said. Take a look closely. What else do you see? Well, if you look closely, you'll see boats. You'll see people in these boats, and they're trying to escape, trying to move through the waves, trying to battle against the forces of nature, of fate, of everything that could possibly work against them. However, our tour guide said, don't you notice something? If you were a Japanese, our tour guide claimed, so I can't count for the veracity of this, but he said, if you're a Japanese and you truly know this wood cutting, you will recognize not the wave, not the boats, but Mount Fuji in the background, seen here. Mount Fuji, he said. It's the symbol of Japan. It's something that endures through time and across art. But, he said, there is something else that it stands for. We will be in so many different boats, across generations, across lives, and across countries and continents. We will weather giant storms and great waves, but Mount Fuji will always stand, and it will keep on standing for as long as it has the strength. And he said, that is Japanese resilience. It is a story embedded in art, and you will not know it unless you ask, unless you talk, unless you converse. And it is something that is so deeply embedded that it is part only of the memories and dreams of a people. This talk will look at conversations, memories, and dreams. And we'll look beyond information packaging, which we often hear about as associated with climate change communication. But in talking about this, I want to start from my own woodcut, something that I was very used to when I was much younger, a bench and theoretical scientist. I'm a molecular biologist, as you heard from the profile. And there was something that always was drilled into me as a communicator. You are a scientist. You know more than people do about the topics that you know about, and knowledge will carry people through. So teach people the facts, people will listen, and people will change their attitudes. I've long since discovered that this doesn't work, but there is something called the mini me world. And this is something I've written about, and it's something I lived through. People who have been trained deeply in a field tend to assume that everybody else will think like them. They'll think rationally. Engineers might assume that people always want things to be more efficient. Or doctors will always assume that patients want to take care of their health and nothing else. And there's nothing wrong with that. It is what it is. But it is a common pitfall, shall I say, or a result of being trained for so long in the field. Here's a common example. Many scientists, including myself 20 years ago, expected everyone would make decisions based on facts, then learn when given this information, and then make intuitive connections between information and action. As I said, it is what it is. But where does this come from? Why do we expect everyone to be a mini version of ourselves out in reality? It might come from the whole idea of socialization. Scientists learn by sitting in a classroom, listening to lectures, and then going into the laboratory, practicing an experiment or a craft, I should say, and then finding out how these concepts apply in the real world. They're socialized in that way, so they do tend to think if people are simply given facts, then they'll make decisions. If people are given the right data, they'll just make decisions. And this is something that has long been in the science communication imagination. Give people information, they will make decisions. Except not everyone does this. The classic example is many of us know that burgers are bad. We have all the data to tell us that burgers are bad, and yet we still eat burgers. It's data, it's fact, it's research, but we haven't made that decision yet. Information is not enough. And this attitude of the mini-me world influences how scientists regard the task of communication itself. It influenced me. I always thought that communication was all about just giving people everything they need to know right out of the textbook. Here's an example of that factual treatment of communication. We often get these weather maps when the weather goes bad in the Philippines. Or if we want to talk about climate, we get charts and graphs. And scientists do prescribe these because these are visual representations of reality. Here comes a storm, it's this big, this is how much rainfall we're getting, everybody move out of the way. Or on the right, these are the tropical cyclones that we've had in the last few years, yellow for neutral years, red for the El Nino, blue for the La Nina years. Now take a look at all this data, start planning. When I first entered science communication, I thought I would have to learn how to make these graphics. I'd have to make a pretty graph. I'd have to make a pretty chart. I would have to make beautiful communication materials because that's the job of communication. As I studied it, however, I realized these are messages. They're just messages, but they don't communicate. And it was a great moment of both eureka and euphoria, but it was a humbling experience because I realized it was just data. And I had been conditioned to believe it was all that was needed. But I hadn't asked the question, what about the people who see this? What is their context? They aren't blank sheets of paper just waiting to be written on. They're not empty buckets to be filled. They're not people who have no experience or no knowledge at all. They are people. So, and as I moved forward through my studies, what should we do? We do need to ask, who are our publics? Most people say, what about audiences? Doesn't that sound the same? Audience comes from the Latin audire, to listen, and it makes an assumption that people will simply absorb, listen, take in, and then act. But a public is a more generic term for people who are out there in the public sphere, who become our audience, but who also become people with whom we converse, people perhaps whom we serve, people that will listen to us, maybe not, people that will listen and then reinterpret what we say. They are many publics. And we have to ask as well who they are, but seek not to manipulate them. That's not the point. We seek to understand who they truly are and to meet them on ground that is understanding, not necessarily rational, but, and as Dr. Carcy Cruz said, that looks at them as humans with hearts. Small is beautiful. It wasn't about packaging. And this is something I realized years after I started science communication. But a few months after I started really studying it in detail, it's no longer about packaging. It shouldn't ever have been about packaging. It's about listening. And science is part of that great story. Because science, as well as society that surrounds it, as well as the publics that are a part of it, we aren't made up of mere facts that can be divided according to our whims. We are caught in a beautiful reality of the moment in our conversations. We have the past, our memories. We have the future, our dreams. In this part of the presentation, I will define each of these terms, and then I'll talk about research that I did in the Visayas and some parts of Luzon after Typhoon Haiyan. I did this research back in 2017 and 2018, a few years after Typhoon Haiyan blew through the Philippines and destroyed many of our provinces. It was a learning experience, but it was also a blaming experience. Who was at fault? The media pinned the blame on not translating everything into the local languages. Many people pinned the blame on the government for not being prepared. Others pinned the blame on scientists for not being accurate. But in this research, I found it was more than just facts, more than just who told what in what language. And it had to take a full and deep dive into how people talked about science, what they dreamed about, and what they remembered. So I will intersperse my definitions with my experience and findings from this research, and I hope that this will spur discussion later on. So let's talk about conversations. Most people think that conversations are exchanges. Here comes an expert, and this person will get feedback from people. But in the strictest sense of the word, and especially in communication, a conversation talks about interactions among equals. People will hold no power here. There will be no expert versus a non-expert. There will be no pulling in of feedback, or there will be no, here's information, now let me know what you think. A conversation is about sharing rather than teaching. And it dissolves the idea that we have to bring information to the ground or on the ground or learn from people in the grassroots. It also takes out the idea of the ivory tower. There is no climbing to be done here. There is no digging to be done here, but it happens all in the moment. It is constructed in the moment. In the research I did for Typhoon Haiyan, I found that some communities that were affected by Typhoon Haiyan didn't necessarily ignore the warnings. They also didn't necessarily not trust science. But because they were far from government or perceived that they were very far from national government, they like to talk to each other before making major decisions. And the spur of that discussion came from media coverage about the storm. People would all tune in. Different houses would all have their own channel. One house would have ABS-CBN, the other would have TV5, the other would have GMA. And then when everyone heard about the news, everyone would open their windows and start shouting to each other. What do we do? They'd start conversing. They'd start discussing. And then they decide to evacuate by giving people certain jobs. So they tell someone to bring the water, someone to bring the rice, someone to bring the porridge, someone to bring the food. But the point is, it wasn't the media itself that told them what to do. They didn't pack their things immediately. They discussed. In the Western or the non-Filipino literature, this is often called milling, and it has negative connotations attached to it. It seems to say that people like to wait for prompts and just wait for the weather to change. But I think that this is very unique, or if not unique, authentic to our experience. It's not milling, it's deliberation, and we need that discernment, that closeness to a community before we make decisions. Now let's talk memories. Memories in general are reflections on experience. And whenever we talk about memories and monuments, we tend to think of statues that are there that reflect not just the experience, but reflect how we must learn from this event. On the left, you will see a photo of one of the tsunami stones of Japan. And these tsunami markers tell you, or at least tell the Japanese, that years and years ago, centuries ago, this was how far the water went when a tsunami hit. So if you are smart enough, do not build below this marker, because if a tsunami happens again, we are going to be underwater from this point downward into the ocean. It's a reflection on experience driving a future goal and a future task. The photo at the bottom is a relatively newly erected monument for those who suffered from Typhoon Yolanda, Typhoon Haiyan. And it depicts a woman in the palm of a hand with her children waiting for aid. But I think it's more powerful than that, just waiting for aid. I think this is a woman looking forward, hoping for something, and hoping that people learn from this experience so that they never repeat its mistakes or all the mistakes that led to it again. While we think that monuments alone are our reflections on experience, I also invite you to see that our online archives are actually our monuments. Pag-asa has an annual tropical cyclone tracking system as well as database, and you can see all sorts of files on there that tell you what typhoons have been like years and years ago, excuse me. And these online chronicles of our lives allow us as well to look back on these experiences, reflect on them, and take action backed by data. So there is it might look soft, but this is actually consistent with the nature of science itself. Trends, looking at data, using data to back up action. Most people talk about this as some soft skill. Why do you have to talk about memories? And this was something that was brought to the fore in the recent election, the collective memory, a national consciousness. Why can't we just forget? Reflection helps us to create lessons. And often, we tend to use moving on, the whole idea of moving forward. It is rampant, and it's given such angel wings as a notion, as though people who moved on were much stronger than those who look back at their memories. It is dangerous, especially when we are facing more violent storms than those that have come in the past. When we are facing a climate emergency that tells us everything that we've been doing so far isn't working and we must do better. Moving on has been such a part of so many cultures. We do look like a moving on people. And I turn to communication to talk about this cultural experience of moving on. Our media looks episodic. Most of my students don't realize this, but we often talk about stitching stories together. And they often ask, Mom, why do foreign comedy movies look like they have a complete story? While local comedy movies look like all these tattered threads of sketches that all just came together and were made to make a story, that comes from, well, of course, this is speculation, but it really looks like that moving on, that episodic, that short-term memory in play, stitch together things. The stories might not matter, but let's laugh in this time that we have and then move forward. Something else that can be traced to this or linked to it, the whole idea of using just small amounts or buying just small amounts of your utilities. I'm sorry, excuse me, your most useful products every day. Sachets of shampoo, sachets of conditioner, tiny bars of soap come with their own very conveniently placed plastic and plastic packaging, bad for the environment, but it caters to the everyday life of Filipinos. Let's survive today. Forget about tomorrow. We're not sure. Forget about tomorrow. Forget about yesterday. Let's survive today. And they all tie together, that we seem to be in the moment. What about our memories? While we look like a moving on people, it appears we do have communities that commemorate major disasters. They remember. People don't forget. Those who don't forget aren't just covered by the media. Their memories remain. And research does show that those who also remember major disasters have very good evacuation rates. They know what it feels like to be hit by a storm, to be hit by a disaster, and they don't want the disaster to happen ever again. They tend to be reflexive. They look back and learn. They don't look back with sadness and wallow in the sadness. Their approach to the past and to memory is learning and reflection. Now let's talk dreams. People think that this is something you do only when you're asleep, but there have been lots of competitions around dreams. The future city, the co-futures, the speculative fiction prize. All of these represent hope for our future, whether they're written or worked out on a computer or created using recyclable material. They all represent us looking forward, creating an imagined future. But it's more than that. It's not simply speculation coming from the moment. Dreams are linked to the past. Dreams are a look at the past so that we can imagine a future that, well, I hate to use the word, but logically follows. A future that can change the world, not just because someone wants to change the world, but because someone looked back at the past and said, something is wrong. Let's make things right. When I talk about the idea of dreams and projections to scientists, they sometimes look back at me and go, that doesn't feel scientific. It feels soft and it feels like this mass of being that you can't quantify. What's a dream? If we speak from the language of science, this is actually looking at trends, using one's imagination to look beyond the past and the present and into a future. Scientists do it all the time without knowing it. They extrapolate data. They're dreaming of what that data might look like. They're dreaming of what these trends mean in the long term. We are all creatures of dreams, and we all have different ways of dreaming. Maybe you're making an equation in your head so that you can see what the future will bring. Or maybe you're making scenarios in your head that come from a past. But these are not foreign. And in fact, most people think that most people don't dream in a country where we have where everything is just episodic in the moment. But research does show people do learn from their mistakes. But there is some nuancing here. Sometimes, and we have seen this in research, especially in Haiyan, people can't imagine an outcome from trends. And this is consistent with the literature. People don't bank on trends. They don't use trends to imagine a future. They can only imagine what they have experienced before. And it is this experience that might help them. But even that is nuanced. In our research in Typhoon Haiyan, we found that some communities can't imagine what a greater storm will be. You can ask communities, what does a signal number 2 storm feel like? Oh, okay, my house will fall. All right. What does a signal number 3 storm feel like? My house's roof will blow away. What does a signal number 4 feel like? Oh, I've never gone through that before. I don't know what that's like. Yes, but you've gone to 2 and 3. What do you think will happen with 4? The answer, I really don't know. I still haven't experienced it. I can't imagine what it's going to be like. And it's a very different way of looking at the world. But again, this isn't something that you can get if you talk to people about facts or if you ask them, what do you know? However, if you ask them, what's happening? What do you think? What do you know about this? What do you think about this? What does this look like to you? Then the conversation changes because it's not just about knowledge and it's not just about textbooks or graphs and charts and trends. It becomes about speculation and thinking. I once saw this, and I'm just replicating it here. I once saw this figure where conversations were plastered right in the middle of memories and dreams. But I'd like to bring these two circles much closer to each other, the memories and dreams part. We can't dream without our memories. We can't look forward without knowing what the past is like. And we can't look back without knowing what we're looking for. So conversations sit right in the middle comfortably. They are a way for us to access what people remember and what people dream about. But more than that, conversations tell us that communication is not simply putting information into a pretty package for people to consume. It's more than looking back at the past and putting it down. It's more than looking forward at trends and putting them down and then saying, everybody look at this infographic. We can have conversations. They're a form of communication. We can unearth people's concerns, help them solve their own problems. That's a form of communication as well. We could have a lecture, but we could also get feedback and engage people. Most people would come into this looking at these bullet points and think, oh, these are 3 separate things that I can do on separate occasions for different problems, but they actually bleed into each other. Sometimes a lecture leads to a conversation. Sometimes a lecture awakens a dream in someone and they realize what their problems are and they realize how to solve them. But they're all different ways of communicating because communication is not just about spreading the word and disseminating. Correction there, dissemination is only one kind of communication. And this might just be me, but every time someone in government says something to the tune of, oh, we should have better information dissemination, I cringe and I get really mad because all that dissemination assumes is that we simply need to spread the word out and everyone's going to listen. And whoever gets hit by the information, let's hope that they listen. But communication is very targeted. It's tailored. It listens. Dissemination was effective before the Cold War, when education wasn't standardized, when not everyone had the chance to know about science and about the world. But dissemination itself is just one kind of communication. Conversing is another. Dialogue is another. Unearthing people's concerns, still another. It is much more diverse than simply spreading the word. Because it's not about an authority that simply spreads its facts across, because expertise is everywhere. And this is what I love about climate communication. It's a long-term look at reality. And nowhere can we get that long-term look than at people's stories and how they construct the world through their myths, through their stories of a past, of creation, of the people who have gone before, of ancestors, of ghosts, of the invisible. These stories tell us so much about how people construct the world because it is their reality. And there are places where science cannot reach, and science cannot hope to reach because these are places where science wasn't practiced. Case in point, and I love telling this story, the Marshall Islands in the South Pacific, a very old culture and one of the most vulnerable to climate change. However, most people there don't think in terms of climate change don't act on climate change or didn't act on climate change. And the question for years was, why not? Why don't they know about climate? What do they not know? Notice the use of knowledge, of factual, objective information. A journalist, Peter Rudiak Gold, visited the islands and lived there. And he asked about what people knew about climate. And that was when he found out what the problem was. When we think in terms of facts and simply giving information, we then tend to think that language is just there to be translated. So if you translate the word climate change into a local language, then you'll get action. So for years, people were translating the word climate change into the native Marshallese language. That was where the problem was. The word for climate in Marshallese stands for universe, cosmos. Change was still change. But if you put them together, it was cosmic change. Who in their right minds would try to battle against the cosmos? No one. It was crippling. Mere translation didn't work. But when Peter Rudiak Gold started talking to these people about their experiences, their stories, then he realized they know more. They know about how the tides and levels of water have changed. They know about the weather, the changes and patterns. They know about what to plant and what not. We often call it indigenous knowledge, but it's really the knowledge of humanity that goes beyond the laboratory, which now tells us if we want to do science communication, risk communication, climate change communication, anything for climate, we need more research. We need to listen. And it might take any of these following forms. We could ask people to tell their stories of how they dealt with a hazard. This is something that I've seen a lot in the literature lately. Ask people to build models of their communities and then ask them where are your problem spots. And once they identify where these problem spots are, they also realize, oh, this is where a problem spot is. I know how to solve it. I know why things go wrong. They make the connections themselves rather than being told, this is where things are wrong, just accept the technology and let's move on. Then they take ownership of the solution. Still speaking of conversations, another kind of research might look like engaging in conversations with a variety of people about how they understand complex terms like climate change or weather. Because believe it or not, most people don't understand what the weather is like or what the weather is for that matter. This has happened in Nepal, I believe, as well as Bhutan and some of the North Asian countries. There has been research on how people regard weather patterns. The activity in that research consisted of making a specific public make their own calendar. And then if you see how they regard the world and the patterns and the seasons, when they see that right in front of them and they see the patterns being broken or going out of sync, then they realize, wait a minute, something's changing. This I've seen in more locations around the world, especially in Aboriginal places. Especially in places where traditional ecological knowledge is now at the fore. And especially, I believe in Aboriginal places in Australia, people are given cameras and then they're asked, what does your community mean to you? And you make them take photographs and the photographs tell their story better than if they were to articulate it. And this is especially good for communities that have a language that is difficult to learn and for which we'll have very few translators. And finally, make them tell stories to each other. Imagine futures, because it's not just about today, nor is it about yesterday and tomorrow. It's a long road from the past to the future. Communicating climate change isn't always just putting these facts together or packaging. It can be conversing with people on equal ground. It can mean asking them to remember what has come, what once was, and it can also ask them what is to be. Because we are people, not machines, not software, not charts. We're people. We love stories. And it's not just the love of stories that carry us through. It is where these stories tell of our reality. Because years from today, centuries from today, when humanity looks back on our generation, perhaps it will see the generation that saved the planet. And it didn't do it just by looking at textbooks. It looked to the future, imagined the great future, dreamed together so that everyone who had their own knowledge, had their own emotions, and had their own lives brought everything together into a comprehensive, cohesive whole. And perhaps that is how we can communicate, how we can converse, how we can use our memories, how we can truly dream. I now welcome all questions and comments, but for the moment, thank you. Good afternoon from Manila.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ponce de Leon. That was a very eye-opening discussion on how we can link conversations with both our memories and dreams, the limitations of translations, and the transformative power of stories. I personally found it quite interesting how you stitch those concepts together. In fact, I believe our audience also feels the same way, as we have some comments and questions that I'll read out first before we dive into the rest of the questions. So first comment comes from Mr. Edson Dongo. He says that this is a very well-informed research and it's very powerful. And another comment from Dr. Ted Shepard, I think that the photograph approach is used in Indigenous communities in the Canadian Arctic.
Thank you so much, Dr. Shepard. Yes, I'm sorry, I mixed up my research, but you're right. Yes, it is in the Canadian Arctic. Yes, thank you.
Yeah. All right, so I'll dive into the first question that we have from the chat. This is also from Mr. Edson Dongo. The majority of us seem like we are moving forward in terms of climate, I think he means. So how can we best move on in reality? So to clarify, he also adds, I'm starting to believe that all the information around climate change is in fact disinformation from capitalistic behavior to make people seem as if we are moving.
Oh wow, that's a lot to take in and unpack at the moment. But okay, if I might, years ago I was trying to get into a research collaboration, but it since hasn't happened because of the pandemic. But there was a project that we wanted to put together with the University of Manchester, where they do work on, climate change communication, but in decolonizing climate change communication. So that actions aren't about marginalizing the poor further. Now, let me explain. Many of the actions that we are prescribed to take require that we give up a lot of our comforts. And there's nothing wrong with that. Give up your car. It's great. Give up your anything else, give up your plastics. That's fine. Okay. But for those who, to begin with, are working in an infrastructure that works against them, who are poor to begin with, who have a very difficult time even just living in day to day, how does this translate? Are you asking them to spend more because they can't even afford to feed themselves? Are you asking them to give up maybe that jeepney ride or that tricycle ride and walk because they live really far away in communities that are so isolated, but they do need to work and they still need to contribute to the economy, but the infrastructure that surrounds them doesn't allow them to do that. So we wanted to bring that to the fore. Now, I'm not saying that all of this is capitalistic and climate change is not real and the capitalists are just feeding us information. But what I think, and I hope I'm not confusing anyone here, what I think is going on is the information that surrounds climate change is good. The repackaging of it in order to gain attention might sometimes be harmful if it marginalizes groups that do not have the capacity to act on climate or to act so that things are better. And if we rely too much on critiquing information as well, or in repackaging information, we miss out on the opportunity, to actually talk to people, to ask them how they understand it, and perhaps in conversing with them, to find ways how we can all contribute, how we can all work together so that we can still find a way to solve the problem in our context, understanding our culture, working within our infrastructure without alienating those who are affected the most, without alienating those who need help the most. So I'm not sure if I would say that information is bad. I think the information and the research is good. The angling of it is very much for an audience that can afford to give up its comforts. But so much needs to be done to understand how people understand climate here, and we can't make those assumptions readily. I hope this makes sense. I hope I haven't been blabbering for too long, but thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ponce de Leon. It's great that you mentioned a nuanced repackaging and communication of that based information, because our next question actually has something to do with this. So this is also from Dr. Shepard. Climate scientists talk a lot about users. They mean users of climate information. You talk instead about publics. Can you discuss how the different terminology can change the nature of communication?
All right. What a lovely question that might take me a whole other workshop. Okay. The term user, and I'm going to use it. I am going to use the term the way that I've understood it. The term user does have its connotations. The word use itself makes the assumption that people use information, that they rely on information to make a decision, and that they will put paramount information. Excuse me, sorry. They will put importance on information as the way or as the path toward a decision. But there's another way as well to understand what user means. It means if you have communication, any message, its information has to be useful, actionable. And most of my colleagues in some languages or who are very much sticklers for English do not like that word, and I am so sorry. Actionable, something you can act on. So when you look at these two different paradigms of the term user, you'll find that the stress is on making people take action on something. It doesn't necessarily make the communication bad. It doesn't make it anything good or bad. It just shows and reveals what the aim of the communication is. Because the communication can aim to do anything: raise awareness, entertain, educate people, give them information, make them have an informed decision. But notice that all of these five different constructs, awareness, education, information, opinion making, understanding, look at these five constructs. None of them talk about action. Okay, so when you use the term user, there is an assumption that whatever it is, it's going to make people take action. So if you put any information on there, there's something that must be acted upon or can be acted upon. Publics is a more generic term, and I learned this from my advisor in graduate school, as well as from everyone here in the Department of Communication. We don't like using the term users because it's always geared toward telling people, hey, this is information, now do something. Okay, but if you want to do that, fine, but it has to be very clearly stated. But if it's publics, it's a generic term. It means people. It acknowledges that that group has its own characteristics and it has its own frames of knowledge. It will understand the information in one way, and it will not always match your understanding, and you must accept that it will happen and that there is very little you can do about it. And if you try to fight that, then you are only alienating your public further. So I use that term as well in my class, publics, because it invites the students to consider all the many aims. Do you want to raise awareness? That's great. Do you want to educate? That's nice. Do you want to give information? Okay. Do you want to make people change an opinion? All right. Do you want to make them understand an issue? Good. But nowhere is there action in there. So they have to be very careful about how they design the message, because how it is designed must fit the ultimate goal. So I'm not saying that one is more different. Perhaps publics is a more generic term that covers all the many aims. User is one such goal. Audience is another. So if you call them an audience, you just expect them to listen to information. There's another word. Reader is the word I've been looking for. To our readers, you're expecting information to be shown to our readers. And now I forgot what the other word was, but the way we frame the audience also changes or reveals what our goals are. I hope that made sense.
And I guess thus it's also a difference in what the role of the other person in the conversation is, whether they are users or our publics. So, Dr. Ponce de Leon, I wonder if you're able to read my mind, because that ties in very neatly to our next question. So this reads, I believe there is evidence from neuroscience that memories and dreams are crucial for taking action. Do you think that it is helpful to bring this argument to bear in convincing scientists to change their approach? And this question is also from Dr. Shepard.
Oh, that's such a beautiful question. Oh my goodness. I don't know how to answer it, but yes, I have seen, and I have seen only the abstracts. I haven't read the articles, but yes, that our sense of memory, our collective memory, our need to archive is tied to action. It's tied to our culture as well, and it's tied to our ability to dream. I really would love to forward this to scientists, but I'm still working on, I hate to say the word wording. I really want to frame it in the language that science uses, because memories and dreams are tied to science. The nature of science is that of long-term vision. Science is very rarely ever short-term. Science is always long-term. It always assumes that knowledge is incomplete, but what we have at this point in time, given that it is empirically collected and systematically analyzed as the best information. But we must also be humble enough to we must be humble enough to accept that perhaps tomorrow our knowledge will be refuted or built upon or confirmed. But we always look to the past in order to project into the future. And this is why science really relies on data, because that's how it makes the projection from past to future. We rely on data. So I might need to use that kind of, I might have to relate it to the nature of science itself. And if once I get to do that, perhaps it would be much easier to talk to scientists from their perspective. But it's still in its infant stages. I do welcome comments on this, because I'm seeing more and more that we sometimes isolate science from stories, but everybody tells a story, and so does science, and it just tells it in a different way. And sometimes all of us, those of us who have worked in the laboratory, will look down on stories and think these are just your imaginations. But really, scientists also imagine. They have a scientific imagination. It's just a different kind of imagination. So anyway, to answer the question, Dr. Shepard, I'm working on it, but I really do want to bring this to scientists, but I really want to use their language first. And I think that would necessitate a much more time to read into the different philosophies and nature and logic of science as a discipline itself.
Thank you, Dr. Ponce de Leon. It really is a complex question to ponder, and it does remind one of the rising trend of either hope for the climate or doomism for the
Yes.
climate, and whether and how we need to tweak how our information is communicated. But of course, moving on to the next question, this is from Ms. Angela Cristina Cabrera. So to bring it a bit closer to home, how do you get past that smart shaming tendency as a barrier with science or risk communication? So get past in Filipino the ikaw na magaling or madaming alam, which in English translates to know it all.
Oh, wow. Okay, I cannot claim to have ever done that successfully because I myself have been the target of, oh, ikaw na, sige na. And I jokingly retorted, yup, me. And I did, and I said, yeah, I have a PhD. Thank you. Which is the worst thing you can do, but it really completely silenced the other person. But don't do that, please. I think everyone here wants to stay friends with everybody around them. But that is a very difficult question. Now, this is something that was once asked as well of me in a podcast. And the question was, like yours, how do we get past smart shaming? Now, there's another perspective. It might not be smart shaming, but it might be arrogance shaming. What do I mean? The way we approach something, say to correct someone or to give our own opinion, we toe the line often between outright arrogance and humble knowledgeability. And it's very hard to balance the two, especially when it is online, because all nuance of language, body language, of tone, of discernment, everything is gone and wiped out completely. When this happens online, I often tell, and my students have asked me this as well, how do we stop smart shaming? I go, don't respond, just don't, because that's not the venue and it will not be fruitful. Now, when you're face to face, something I learned, and I don't know if this is still going to be true, but when someone says something like, oh, I've heard this before, uh, look at all of these earthquakes, they're happening because of climate change. I'm like, what? If I had approached it with no, because tectonic plates, come on, what does that have to do with climate change? It is a tone of arrogance because, and I don't even need to use the, oh, come on, tectonic plates. I don't even need to use continental drift or whatever word there is. The whole idea of using facts to counter a previously held belief that might be very deeply ensconced. The whole idea of using facts is alienating and it is frightening, especially to people who haven't spent their time in a classroom and don't learn using a lecture. It's like being told, hey, you don't know enough. Let me educate you. That's it. It's the whole, even if you don't mean to. So if it were face to face, something I learned was ask where people get the information, but don't, of course, ask it. So where did you get that information? Even that tone is condescending. It's, why do you believe that? Where did you hear it before? And I've tried this of all people. I've tried this with my mother, and it wasn't. It was not climate change and earthquakes. It was a whole other ball game. But she eventually realized she got her information from YouTube. And she wasn't sure who was talking, but they were wearing a white lab gown and they had doctor attached to their name. So she wasn't sure, but then she went quiet and said, I'm not sure. Maybe I have to find out. And it's in that moment of quiet that you leave people alone, rather than say, see, what did I tell you? It is not earthquake. What is wrong with you? It's that moment of silence that allows people to discern on their own. So it's a very different model of communicating. It starts with the question, the most powerful of all questions. Why do you believe that? Where did you get this information? Why is this true? So I don't know if that's going to work, but it will not work online. I guarantee you it will make you lose your friends, but please don't respond online. I know we all have that temptation to make people stop spreading misinformation, but it is too toxic, and people do not come online to learn. They come online to just vent. So it's not a place. And yes, that's why I do not read the comment section. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Ponce de Leon. I think we can all learn a lot. We can all save ourselves a lot of headache from not reading comment sections.
Yes.
And there really is a lot of nuance that gets lost in the online space. And I agree that it is quite a difficult line to toe between what you termed as humble knowledgeability and perceived arrogance. So we have time for one last question, maybe to tie into what you mentioned earlier about the language of science. So this question reads, the photo of the tsunami stone in Japan as a monument to memory seems to be like citizen science from centuries ago. You discussed milling that is actually deliberation, and this seems to be both a living and non-tangible form of that citizen science. Would you like to speak more on this?
Ooh, about milling. Oh, yes. Okay. The term milling itself comes from the Western literature and how people respond to storms. And it's often, it's given a very bad connotation. And I was actually, and I hate to say this, I was forced to give it a bad connotation by a reviewer in a paper because I couldn't defend that this was really deliberation, it is discernment, it is community. But if I were to rewrite that paper, I would say that it might be a form of milling, but it is also a sign that we should not derogate the idea of milling as delay, because sometimes the delay helps us to move more efficiently. What does this mean? There are some communities that I visited where they couldn't always evacuate because to do so would mean bringing trucks up mountainous regions, which would take a while, which would take a lot of fuel, for which they had no budget. And then preparing food at evacuation centers, which would require a much larger budget. To evacuate meant to spend money. So they had to first deliberate. They had to first talk amongst each other. What can we bring? What food can we bring? Okay, you're bringing rice. That's nice. You're bringing fish. Good. Who's bringing water? Who's bringing milk for the kids? Who's watching the kids? And then evacuation happened faster because people weren't just running for the, running down the hill and looking for people to, looking for an evacuation center. They took charge. They might not have had rain gauges. They didn't have markers the way that the Japanese might, or they didn't have like, how shall I say, they didn't have evidence of citizen science that showed that they were using their own instruments. But they had knowledge of each other and what their community needed. So it was a strong network of people who knew each other very well, which is why in the Philippines, for many parts of the country, the barangay system really works. The local leaders are trusted. The local trust networks operate to help people move forward. So I don't know if I can term it citizen science as much as it is intimate cooperation. And I once brought this to an auditor's meeting when they were looking at our research. And I did tell them, our communities like talking to each other. They actually do say, we don't read your signs, we don't read your posters, but we have to talk to each other first and then discern together. And then that's how we evacuate. We know who brings what, we know where to find people, we know who to contact. That's how it works. So don't give us posters. Don't give us things labeled with, this path of your exit into the wherever barangay. Just tell us what to do and then we'll talk amongst ourselves. And I brought it up. Response of government, because government was our funder. Response. We really just want something to print on a poster. Just tell us what to put on a poster and then we'll put it in the community. And my response was, they don't read your posters. They don't care about your posters. help your local governments earn the trust of people and work with them so that they can coordinate better. Train the local governments, train your barangays. Nope, they said, that's too abstract. Training is abstract. Tell us what to put on a poster and then they'll take care of it. It was exhausting. To this, and when we had the second iteration of that project, I backed out completely because they weren't listening. Because the point of the whole auditing was, here's our research, and this is what the research says. And you, as scientists, listen to empirical data, right? So it turns out they were listening more to, we need posters because local governments, the mayor, want something to put their stamp on, courtesy of the mayor. A poster is going to do that. It will help them campaign. It will help them earn and keep their position. Training program, not so much, too abstract. Pick something else, something that we can print courtesy of the mayor on. So we're bumping up against an infrastructure that doesn't really make sense. Sorry, so blunt about it. But we're also bumping up against an infrastructure that prioritizes things other than strengthening people so that they can help themselves. And I hope that in helping people talk to each other, we can get that critical mass of people who genuinely have curiosity about the world and want to help each other because they understand each other, rather than just give people information and let them do what they want with it. It lacks interaction. Most importantly, it lacks compassion. And that genuine compassion, I think, has been missing. And I really hope it's returned, put back where it belongs. I don't know if that made sense, Danielle. I now forgot the original question. That's how bad it is. So much for memories.
I mean, that's quite all right because it shows just how interconnected all of these concepts that we discuss about are really, intertwined with each other. And it's quite interesting because your example really touches on the theme of community solidarity, which quite interestingly we touched on in our very first session last October 14. So I'm very sorry that we have to cap the discussion here. It's a very rich and dynamic discussion that we're having. We do have another question. If you don't mind, Doc Inez, maybe we can send this to you and then we
Sure.
can forward your response to the participant via email.
Okay. And I hope that's all right with the participant. And I'm so sorry I talk way too much. This is one of my, this is one of the things I love talking about.
Yeah, so to maybe just cap this portion of the program, I just want to read some of the comments here. So we have a comment from Dr. Ted Shepard replying to Edson. I think that is a very perceptive insight. The rich countries don't want to acknowledge the history that has led to the present climate crisis, which certainly involves colonialism, both historical and present day. And in that sense, they are saying we need to move on. And Mr. Edson Dongo also says, I'm very much moved with the way you are explaining the importance of effective communication and how we break these barriers in the face of the climate crisis. Like in my case, I teach climate education to my primary kids. They have been affected by Cyclone Idai back in 2019 and the memories still haunt them.
Wow.
Okay. And we do have one more comment. I'm sorry. Let me just read this out from Chris Leonard. One suggestion given to me last week was to develop long-lasting relationship with your country's climate negotiators and regional or municipal equivalents. I realize this moves away a bit from the local scale, but certainly affects this scale.
Yeah. And I think it would. It still stays within the scale because most people do trust people who know where they are and know what their experiences are, rather than a government up there that just dictates without knowing what it's like for people to actually live with a hazard and have to contend with disasters. But yes, thank you.
Yes. So again, thank you very much, Dr. Ponce de Leon, and thank you very much to our participants for your questions and a very engaging open forum. Again, I'm very sorry that we cannot accommodate all of the questions, but Doc Inez has agreed to answer these through email, and we will forward these to you as soon as you receive her response. So thank you for understanding that. But I'm afraid we do now have to move on to the next part of the program, which is the awarding of the certificate. We present this certificate of appreciation to Dr. Maria Inez Angela Z. Ponce de Leon for sharing her time and insights in the webinar entitled Conversations, Memories, and Dreams, Climate Communication that Goes Beyond Information Packaging on the 23rd of November, 2022. The certificate is signed by Ms. Jean Hardelesa Mijares, the Program Manager for Climate and Disaster Resilience of the Ateneo Institute of Sustainability, and Dr. Charlotte Kendra Gotanco Gonzalez, the Director of the Ateneo Institute of Sustainability and focal point of the My Climate Risk Ateneo de Manila University Regional Hub. Once again, thank you very much, Dr. Ponce de Leon, for sharing your time and insights with us. I'm sure everyone is going to walk away from this session with rich insights and wider minds.
I hope so, but thank
And
you. It's been an honor.
And now to deliver the closing remarks, may we call on Dr. Priscilla Angela Cruz, Assistant Professor and Chair of the Department of English at the Ateneo de Manila University and a collaborator of the My Climate Risk Ateneo de Manila University Regional Hub.
Hello. Good evening. Well, good evening from here in Manila. Hi, Inez. And hi to my very good friend, Inez Ponce de Leon. When I was asked to do the closing remarks today, of course, I couldn't say no. Why would I say no to do this for Inez, whose work I have loved so much all this time? It's been such an honor for me to be a collaborator for the My Climate Risk Hub. And believe me when I say that when I was approached by Kendra, my first reaction was, why me? I'm only an English teacher. But I'm so glad to be here because as I learn from all the work, more than ever, I realize that the climate problem is really probably the most transdisciplinary problem that we will face in this day and age. So that means that it needs everybody from all fields to actually work together to try to figure something out. Inez's talk today, just like her magisterial lecture, which my students enjoy so much, we used it in class a few weeks ago. Inez's talk today reminds me of several very important things. And the first is the fact that when it comes to talking about climate, yes, dissemination is an ugly word. And actually, information may also turn into an ugly word, especially if we think of information as separated from meaning. And what is the difference between information and meaning? Information is a kind of meaning, but the problem is if it's information that is disseminated in a very alienating way, you will get smart shaming and more negative reactions than you would want. So what Inez's talk and what I learned from Inez's talk is that what we need to do is to share meanings. And what does it mean to share meanings? When we share meanings, let me take Inez's example of the burger. So information is one kind of meaning that will tell us burgers are bad. But it doesn't mean anything to me because I love burgers, especially when I'm feeling miserable and all I want is a McDo or a McDonald's burger or some kind of burger. So in that case, if I think of burgers that way as something I will go to make me feel better, then that is now something, information that means to me. So if we continue thinking that science communication is just about repackaging, then that is not sharing meanings. Sharing meanings, though, for instance, would be the examples that Inez gave us about how communities get together to figure out how they're going to address a coming disaster. If you use a word like tsunami, but the meaning is not shared, or in other words, we understand tsunami differently from the way the community understands it, then nothing's going to happen. We're going to get smart shaming. We're going to get all the problems that have been mentioned. So how do we share meanings? Inez's talk gives us a very important point that it's the community that generates the meanings that it shares. And that is true for science as a field. in science, you have a bunch of people who have agreed to share certain meanings. And without these meanings being shared, you won't easily have the scientific field. But you have the local community, which shares meanings in different ways from the scientists. Hence, the communication doesn't go both ways. You just have the meaning of one group of people being imposed on the meanings and invariably, perhaps, invalidating the meanings of another group. So I would have to say that Inez is very wise when she says it's not about repackaging information, really. It was never about repackaging information. It was about listening to people who are most at risk, considering the climate problem, and understanding how we can share their meanings as much as they can share our meanings. So it is now a two-way thing. And I'm remembering something that a student told me before. So I was teaching a class called Descriptions of English. And one student came up to me and said, in her local community in the province, nobody actually understands what the word biodegradable means. So we were talking about how meanings are not shared. So she was saying, will it be possible to do a paper on how to share the meaning of biodegradable? And I said, yeah, sure, go ahead. Unfortunately, her research went somewhere else, but I think that's a very good now example of how we can build on sharing meanings. Another thing I picked up from this talk is really what counts as data. So we have the scientific data, and we all know it's evidence-based, and we look for hard facts, but data is not just in the facts. It's also in community knowledge, in community shared meanings. So let me give you an example. And I was reminded of this also in the climate risk webinar a few weeks ago about how, thanks to the typhoons hitting the south, there was no more name for the wind. And I found that to be a very powerful thing. But here's another anecdote about what counts as data. Last July, I decided to go on holiday, and I went up north to Batanes, our northernmost province. And when I was leaving and planning for the trip, people were telling me, don't go there in July. You will get hit by typhoons and bad weather. So I was nervous, but I decided to go through it. When I got there, the people there told me, actually, we haven't had a typhoon that we consider bad in about 5 years. And I said, oh, really? In fact, the one lady told me, the rain here in Batanes is very friendly. It passes through. It comes for 5 minutes and waters the plants and then leaves. It's not what people in Manila think. And then I said, aren't you scared of bad typhoons? And they say, yeah, we're scared, but we know when a typhoon is coming and we know how bad it will get. So I asked them, how do you know? And then they said, we know what the sky looks like. And I said, really? What does it look like? And then they said, it's hard to say. We just know. And then one of the people I was talking to said, every time they see the news and they watch the typhoons hitting the southern parts of the Philippines, which never used to get hit by it, they were saying, how come they did not know what the sky would look like? And then I was thinking, okay, the look of the sky, this is data. And it's community-based, it's culture-based data. And it is also probably something that needs to be shared in conversation. So it's a memory that needs to be shared in conversations with other people and other communities in order to dream big for the future. So for us in the academe, and I've been in the academe all my life, and if there's one thing I know, the academe has really, we have very good ideas, but we have a habit of not actually talking to the right people. Sorry if that offends anyone. But Inez's talk reminds us that these conversations are very important. We can't talk to ourselves, but we have to share our own meanings with the people we are trying to do something for. Just like we can learn so much by listening to their meanings and understanding them. So let me end by saying, what attracted me personally to the Climate Hub? When I heard about the university's strategic goals, our AMDG locks in domino goals for 2030. My first thought was, if there's a goal I really want, it's integral ecology, simply because I believe that integral ecology is not just about the earth separated from us, but we need to build our communities, we need to build our identities, we need to be part of this community and to figure at this ecology and to figure out how to make everything, to figure out how to make sure that all things and not just living things somehow function and survive in equanimity. So to me, that is what integral ecology is about. And Inez's talk and Inez's work is so admirable because it reminds us all of how interconnected we are and how ecology is impossible without people. And just like people are impossible without the world around us, the natural world around us, which we should learn to live with, not on our terms, but on everybody and everything else's terms. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Cruz, for skillfully synthesizing the session, reflecting on meaning and meaning making. Your anecdote on the community recognizing the sky is very reminiscent of what our first speaker from our October 14 session touched on, what Dr. Emma Porio called Raksagdag. At this point, may we request everyone to please turn your videos on for a group photo for documentation. So we'll just give everyone a few moments to turn your videos on. So nice to see a lot of familiar faces and some new faces who are joining us. All right. Okay, I will be taking the first screenshot in 3, 2, 1. And let me take the second screenshot. Please keep your smiles on your faces. Taking the second screenshot in 3, 2, 1. All right, thank you very much. That was lovely. It's so nice to see our participants. At this point, dear participants, we would greatly appreciate your feedback for our session today. We would like to ask you to answer the event evaluation form with the QR code and link flashed on screen. Requests for e-certificates may be coursed through the same form. Thank you once again, Dr. Ponce de Leon, for sharing your insights and your time. We would also like to take this opportunity to thank the sign language interpreters with us today, Ms. Annalisa Regis Tolentino and Ms. Edna Comia. Thank you very much, ma'am. And to all of you, thank you very much for your participation in this webinar. We hope that you have gained fresh insights on climate communication, meaning and meaning making, and how we can engage with others. Please don't forget to accomplish our event evaluation form. Our tech team has posted the link in the chat. Again, requests for e-certificates will be coursed through the same form. Our next and final session for this series for the year will happen in exactly 2 weeks. We would love to have you again for the 4th and final session of the year titled Shifting from Handover to Handshake, Co-Generating Climate Change Information for Resilience with Dr. Faye Abigail Cruz of the Manila Observatory. That will be on December 7, 4 in the afternoon, Philippine Standard Time. You may register in the link shown on screen. And I'd also like to add as a bonus, since I've made quite a few connections to our October 14 session, you can watch the replays of that and all our other previous sessions on the link tree that you may reach in the QR code. That's it for today's session. Thank you very much, everyone. We're sorry we went a bit over time, but I hope that it was worth the time. Thank you and enjoy the rest of the day.